In this talk, we're going to have two speakers tonight. I'm going to give a 15-20-minute introduction about the events themselves, Athlone, how it fitted into the wider situation, and then our main speaker is Dr. John Gibney of the Royal Irish Academy, and he is going to speak about the national system, the handovers, particularly Dublin Castle, but also talk about the treaty and put the whole event in context, why the handover took place at the time it did on the 28th of February 1922 and how it fitted in to the national scene. So that's it, I'll begin. The 28th of February 1922, the day we're commemorating this evening, was one of the most remarkable days in Athlone's long history. It was a day of marches and speeches, music and singing, cheering and laughter. It was a day when thousands of people crowded into the centre of Athlone to witness the beginning of a new era in Irish history. It was a day when the British Army departed the town and handed control of its military barracks to the soldiers of the new Irish state. Now, as we talk, we're going to see various photos. I won't refer to them. About 40 images, about half of them are from the 28th. Others are from the War of Independence. Some are from that period just before the Civil War, when Athlone was a focus of interest for the entire country, and many of them were given to me by people in the county during one of my stints as historian in residence for County Westmeath. Now, to discuss the 28th of February, we need to discuss the period between July 1921 and February 1922. The July truce between the Irish Republican Army and the British Crown forces was welcomed by the people of Athlone, not least because it brought an end, albeit perhaps temporarily, to the reprisals and ambushes. The Westmeath Examiner and comments that were echoed by many newspapers and public bodies wished Eamon de Valera well in his forthcoming peace conference with David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. The paper continued, "Force has had its trial now on both sides, and it must be the fervent hope of every lover of peace and goodwill, as well as every advocate of freedom, that this long drawn-out quarrel between two nations must be brought to a conclusion on principles of peace and lasting reconciliation." Now, then, over the following months after the truce, the people of Athlone went about their business as the negotiations continued in London. In the town and its vicinity, the IRA, which was now free to operate in the open, continued to recruit and drill, all the time watched by the Crown forces. The IRA designated an officer called Fintan Murphy as the liaison for the counties Westmeath, Roscommon, Longford, Leitrim and Sligo, and Murphy established his headquarters here in Athlone, from where he monitored the truce and handled local communications between the IRA and the Crown forces. And now this new situation, in which two opposing forces patrolled the town, led to scenes that would once have been unthinkable. In August 1921, the IRA and the Royal Irish Constabulary, RIC, worked together after Lister's sawmill in Athlone caught fire. Although they were unable to save the building, their combined efforts prevented the flames from spreading to adjoining buildings. A few weeks later, when Sean McKeown and Harry Boland made a brief visit to Athlone's Prince of Wales, an estimated 2,000 people gathered outside seeking autographs and handshakes. Among the crowd, according to the Freeman's Journal, which was a major and national newspaper of the time, were two English soldiers to whom McKeown supplied his autograph, prefaced with the words, "To friendly Englishmen." Now, those were relatively isolated examples of goodwill between the opposing forces, and given that the outcome of the London negotiations was yet to be determined, a renewal of warfare was still possible. On a few occasions, the IRA and the RIC came close to conflict as both forces sought to carry out police work in the town. A British soldiers stationed in Athlone Barracks in the town's workhouse were particularly unnerved by the changed circumstances in which they found themselves, and seemingly fearful of surprise attacks, they resorted to harassing locals, and there's lots of reports of that from the time. Now, in November, a British Army officer stationed in Athlone was shot at by a group of armed men while travelling by motorcycle in the vicinity of Rindoon in Roscommon. Contemporary reports did not identify the armed men, and the officer, who apparently received a minor wound, made his way safely back to Athlone. Now, while the Crown forces were nervous, Republicans were increasingly assertive. For example, the IRA was acting as a police force. It had done so during the War of Independence, but now could do so more openly. The Athlone Brigade of the IRA maintained what could be described as detention centres, usually abandoned houses in rural areas, where they held those charged with crimes, often theft, until their case was heard before a Dáil court. Such prisons were located at Clonnown, Drumraney, Ballynacargy, Castle Pollard and elsewhere in the county, as well as in Summerhill, County Roscommon. Patrick Lennon, a Summerhill-based IRA officer, described how those prisoners who were convicted were made to work, he said, on the farms or bogs until their charges were disposed of. The Dáil Éireann courts, which had previously been disrupted by the Crown forces, began sitting again in the locality, and they would sit in Moat and Athlone from the truce until the beginning of the Civil War. Now, one of the largest demonstrations of Republican activity during this time was seen in August 1921 with the funeral of Bernard Gaffy, a local IRA officer who died as a result of injuries received earlier in the year at the hands of the Crown forces. Gaffy's funeral brought a huge crowd to Athlone, and prominent among the mourners were members of the IRA's Athlone Brigade and the local branch of Cumann. Contemporary newspapers reported that over 7,000 people gathered in the town, and the cortege, which proceeded to Drum Cemetery after Requiem Mass in St. Peter's Church, was over 3 miles in length. Now, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed on the 6th of December 1921, and that same week, Sean McKeown was appointed commander of the local IRA as part of a wider restructuring. As the highest-ranking IRA officer in the area, his strong support of the treaty was widely noticed and commented upon. There were other indications of local support for the agreement, including a solemn benediction at St. Peter's Church in thanksgiving for the blessings of peace. According to the Freeman's Journal, an immense congregation assembled at the church where special seats were reserved for the officers and men of the Athlone Brigade of the Irish Army. In Moat, the local Sinn Féin club soon signalled its support for the agreement, while Athlone's Urban District Council issued a public notice calling on the representatives for the counties Roscommon and Westmeath to support and vote for the treaty, as by so doing, they will be carrying out the wishes of the overwhelming bulk of their constituents. As Dáil Éireann prepared to vote on whether or not to approve the treaty, numerous local groups called for ratification. On New Year's Eve 1921, meetings of Westmeath farmers were held in locations across the county. Those meetings, which newspapers described as being attended by large crowds, adopted resolutions calling for ratification. The following day, Bishop Garin urged the congregation in Mullingar Cathedral to pray for the treaty's ratification, and days later, Westmeath County Council adopted the following motion: that whilst experiencing our fullest confidence in Dáil, we request Deputy Kenneally and Deputy Larkin Robbins, a Sinn Féin TD, the Dáil representatives of the county, to support by their vote and influence the ratification of the treaty signed by the plenipotentiaries of Dáil Éireann. And of course then the treaty was indeed ratified, albeit narrowly, in early January 1922. Now, the Westmeath Independent, whose Athlone offices had been burned down by the Crown forces in November 1920, began republishing a few weeks after the treaty vote in February 1922. The paper, still owned by the Chapman family, was now edited by Cathal O'Toole. It had been edited by a guy called MacDermot Hayes during the War of Independence. And O'Toole was an experienced journalist, GAA official, and proponent of the Irish language. Under O'Toole, the paper was an avid supporter of the treaty, which it saw as, and to quote, evidence of victory over Britain. By then, however, it was apparent that there was widespread opposition to the treaty amongst IRA brigades in Munster and Dublin, with units elsewhere across Ireland increasingly divided on the issue. In the Mullingar Brigade, for example, James Maguire, one of the most prominent IRA officers in the area, opposed the treaty, and the divisions in the county were becoming clearer. Sean McKeown, based in Athlone, on the other hand, was making efforts to organise pro-treaty IRA forces in the region. The Westmeath Independent directed a warning to those who opposed the agreement, quoting it, "Civil war, who wants it? Have we not suffered enough, sacrificed enough, fought enough? For God's sake, let us strain every nerve to avoid the chaos, the misery, the desolation which war amongst ourselves would bring in its train." Now, despite the increasing animosity, both pro- and anti-treaty sides could still meet in Athlone. In early February 1922, the Athlone Brigade of the IRA and the local branch of Cumann mobilised in the town to commemorate James Tormey's death. Now, Tormey from Moat was a leading officer of the local IRA who had commanded the Athlone Brigade's flying column during the War of Independence. He had been killed in a gunfight with Black and Tans at Cornafulla, County of Roscommon, 12 months earlier. And that February 1922 morning, an estimated 1,000 IRA volunteers, although the number varies from 600 to over 1,000, assembled in Athlone's Fair Green before marching to St. Peter's Church, accompanied by the town's brass and reed band. Now, a quick digression to put those numbers into context. 1,000 IRA volunteers assemble in the town. The British, how did they stand a chance? But of course, this is after the truce, and you've got this period where you had the Fusiliers, and you had the IRA was able to mobilise and meet openly, and its numbers swelled, and it was also the period when we have the beginning of the National Army. During the actual War of Independence, the fighting strength, as it were, of the IRA was, like the Flying Column, for example, had 15 members. And the total number who engaged in ambushes and attacks on the Crown forces probably numbered dozens, maybe 100. So you've got this big divergence between the numbers who actually were involved in active service, so to speak, and the numbers that congregate in this truce period and during the time of the handover. Anyway, contemporary newspapers reported that for this funeral, or for this commemoration of Tormey, large crowds of townspeople turned out, many walking along the sidewalks with the procession and others lined along the route. Now, after the Mass, the cortege travelled to Cornafulla, where IRA officer George Adamson, one of the most well-known names from the period in Athlone, unveiled a cross inscribed in Tormey's honour. The commemoration of Tormey's death was a moment of unity and a moment of remembrance for a comrade, yet that unity was transitory, and the fault lines of a new conflict were becoming clearer by the day. Now, amid those tensions, a handover of power was taking place from the existing British administration to the newly instituted Irish Provisional Government. Now, I'm not going to go into detail into that process here, as John Gibney will describe these events at a national level. What was to take place in Athlone on the 28th of February was part of a process that began with the handover of Dublin Castle on the 16th of January 1922. That day was described by the Irish Times as the day on which the old regime ceased to exist and the Irish Free State took possession of power. That process also involved the withdrawal of the British Army and sections of the Crown forces, such as the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the Auxiliaries. Before the end of 1921, the people of Athlone had already seen the first notable manifestations of the new political reality brought about by the treaty. In mid-December, British soldiers vacated Athlone Workhouse, which they had transformed into a mini garrison. Elsewhere in the town, the British Army was confined to barracks as it made preparations to leave Ireland. Over the following week, small batches of the Crown forces left Athlone almost nightly, with the Black and Tans, much to the relief of locals, leaving the town about early February 1922. Those departures were part of the process that would culminate in the handover of the military barracks from the British to Irish forces. Similar events were taking elsewhere in the county. That month, for example, a large detachment of the British Army's East Yorkshire Regiment left Mullingar for Dublin, from where they sailed to Britain. The British Army also left barracks in Athlone around the same time, or Longford around the same time. So, at 6 a.m. on the Tuesday, the 28th of February 1922, the remaining members of the British garrison began leaving the barracks in small detachments, subsequently departing the town by train. An hour later, the first vehicles in a convoy of over 100 lorries, Crossley tenders, and Red Cross ambulances exited the barracks and drove through Athlone on their way to the Curragh. Some of the vehicles were laden with equipment, while others were filled with soldiers, and it was, as described in the Irish Independent, a very imposing scene. As the British Army was leaving Athlone, civilians and IRA volunteers from the surrounding countryside flocked to the town. They were joined by journalists, representatives of Irish and British newspapers, and a crew from Pate who would record newsreel footage from the day, or of the day's events. Among the journalists were those from the Westmeath Independent, as we have seen, back in action for the first time since November 1920. By 10 a.m., Athlone streets were crowded with pedestrians, intermixed, as described by one contemporary, with uniformed officers and soldiers and men of the IRA rushing hither and thither, making the necessary arrangements for the big historic event. At 10:30 a.m., around 1,000 IRA volunteers mobilised at St. Mary's Square. That number included members of what had been the Athlone Brigade of the IRA during the War of Independence, supplemented by units that had arrived the previous night from Longford and from Beggar's Bush Barracks in Dublin. Around 100 of the men wore full uniforms and carried rifles with fixed bayonets, while all the officers carried revolvers. Shortly after 11 a.m., Commandant General Sean McKeown, as we've seen, the highest-ranking IRA officer in the area, entered Athlone Barracks accompanied by some of his senior officers. They were met by a British officer, Colonel Hare, who formally handed over the barracks. At that point, a few British soldiers on guard duty stood down, exiting the barracks a few minutes later. At the same time, IRA detachments were marching towards the barracks, accompanied by pipers and brass and reed bands. As the leading IRA detachment marched west across the bridge, it encountered the last British soldiers who were emerging from the barrack gate. It was, as the Freeman's Journal newspaper reported, an epic-making scene. The brass and reed band abruptly ceased playing, and there was a moment of silence, broken by the voice of IRA officer Patrick Morrissey, who ordered his men to allow the British troops pass over the bridge. Once the British troops had crossed the bridge, the band started playing Let Erin Remember the Days of Old, and Morrissey ordered his men to advance. Contemporary newspapers reported that as the Irish troops crossed the bridge, there was tumultuous cheering all the way. A large crowd of perhaps 10,000 people followed the Irish troops into the barracks, with 1,000 more outside the walls. There they were met by Sean McKeown, who, accompanied by at least one member of Cumann stood on a car in the main square. McKeown's subsequent speech was widely reported by newspapers both in Ireland and abroad. He began by welcoming his fellow citizens and fellow soldiers of Athlone and the Midlands. McKeown read reference to Sergeant Custume, who had died defending Athlone in 1691, and in whose honour the barracks would soon be renamed. McKeown said, "We look back upon Athlone and we picture Sergeant Custume and the plain volunteers making their brave struggle on that old bridge. We see them tearing plank after plank and firing shot after shot until the last plank went down the river forever." McKeown spoke of how he had escorted Colonel Hare from the barracks, saying, "Thank God the day has now come when I, as your representative and representative of Ireland and representative of the Irish nation, presented arms to the last British soldier and let him walk out the gate." In other words, he skipped it. That comment drew huge applause and laughter from the crowd. The cheering continued when he told them, "As it is, the barracks has come into our hands once more. Through no carelessness will it be lost. We have it and we will hold it." McKeown then turned to his assembled troops, telling them that it is up to you now to maintain the high ideals of Custume and his men. At one point, McKeown spoke about Athlone's history as a garrison town. Athlone, he said, had been symbolised by, and to quote, its barracks, its castle and its dungeons for over 300 years. We had, he said, hatred for Athlone because it represented the symbols of British rule and the might of Britain's armed battalions. He told the crowd that Athlone now instead would become a symbol of an independent Ireland, telling them, "Athlone today for Ireland and for the Midlands, from this day forward shall not represent the monument of British tyranny, but it will be a guarantee to the people of Ireland of their freedom, a guarantee to enable them to live in peace, prosperity and progress." Now those lines, which marks the finale of McKeown's speech, brought loud cheers from the crowd. The crowd's attention then turned towards Athlone Castle, to where McKeown and his officers headed in order to raise the Irish tricolour. They encountered a problem after discovering that the British had cut down the flagpole prior to their departure, although a replacement was found in the form of a mast cut down or taken from a local fishing boat. Contemporary newspapers described the moment when the Irish flag was raised. One said, "Amidst tremendous cheering, accompanied by the throwing of hats and caps in the air by the excited crowds below, McKeown stood up on the ramparts of the castle and hoisted the tricolour. The cheering lasted for several minutes before an IRA party stepped forward and fired 3 volleys into the air. That night there was a banquet at the town in which McKeown was the guest of honour. 2 weeks later, the Royal Irish Constabulary handed over its last police barracks in Fry Place, a moment that marked the complete removal of the Crown forces from Athlone. To read contemporary accounts and to look through photographs of the 28th of February 1922 is to witness a town filled with hopes and fears. The Irish Independent applauded the stirring scenes in Athlone, while the Westmeath Independent described the handover as a splendid, glorious change, proof that Ireland had, and to quote, regained her liberty to rule, guide and direct her own actions. Yet the divisions caused by the Anglo-Irish Treaty could not be overlooked nor forgotten. Athlone Barracks was now under the control of an independent Ireland, but the same Sean McKeown who addressed the cheering crowds of Athlone on that happy day would soon be a leader in a new conflict, a civil war. The divisions in the previously united IRA could be seen on the streets of Athlone and Mullingar as both pro- and anti-treaty forces sought to control the towns. By April, Sean McKeown, who had been lauded in Athlone just a few weeks earlier, was receiving threatening letters from the anti-treaty IRA, and one letter warned McKeown to withdraw your forces or there will be blood on shirts. In the space of a few weeks, as it were, to take McKeown's formulation, Athlone, because of its major military barracks and garrison, went from being a symbol of British imperialism, and remember, the local version of that imperialism was not only manifested in Ireland, since many local men joined the British Army and fought to maintain British dominance in countries such as India, to being the symbol of an independent Ireland controlled by the Irish people. And let there be no doubt that the 28th of February 1922 was a joyous day in this town's history. The thousands of cheering people who crowded into Athlone and into Custume Barracks that day are proof of that. Custume Barracks would become a home and a base for the Irish Defence Forces, and as the decades passed, its soldiers would be deployed across the world as Ireland became engaged in service with the United Nations. But only a few weeks after the handover of February 1922, during April and May of that year, Athlone became the symbol and focus of a country teetering on the precipice of civil war. The violence in Athlone and the shooting of pro-treaty officer George Adamson, an event that still creates controversy, happened in April of that month, or April of that year, and it signalled that the divisions over the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the treaty that led to the handover in the first place, could no longer be contained. But that, as they say, is a story for another day. Thank you. Now, that was just to give local context, and I'm very happy to introduce our main speaker now, and we'll just take a moment or two while I'm doing that to set up the computers. Dr. John Gibney is Assistant Editor with the Royal Irish Academy's Documents in Irish Foreign Policy series. His books include The Shadow of Year, The 1641 Rebellion in Irish History and Memory, published by the University of Wisconsin Press, A Short History of Ireland, 1500 to 2000, by Yale University Press, and he's the co-author with Michael Kennedy and Kate O'Malley of Ireland, A Voice Amongst the Nations, the Royal Irish Academy, and he was heavily involved in developing the exhibition text and co-curating the structure and content for the exhibition, The Treaty 1921 Records from the Archives. Now, his latest book is this one here, very recently published, co-author with Kate O'Malley, who spoke to the Society a couple of years ago about Irish links to India. And the title is The Handover, Dublin Castle and the British Withdrawal from Ireland 1922, published by the Royal Irish Academy. And as soon as he's ready, I'd like you to give John a warm welcome. Thank you.
I suppose I'd like to thank Ian for the introduction, and most importantly, thank you all for turning out here tonight. This is the second time in 2 years I've actually spoken to a live, in-person audience, so to speak. So what I don't know on you is I love you already, and hopefully you're not going to be too much of a tough crowd. Now, I've had to start my computer again, so I'm probably going to waffle on to some degree while things are going here. And I should say that when originally Ian asked me to talk to the Society, it was before Christmas, and the idea was to talk about the treaty negotiations, arising from my involvement in the National Archives Centenary exhibition on the treaty, which is open in Dublin Castle at the moment. If you haven't gone to it, go to it. It is quite simply the best exhibition ever presented anywhere about any subject whatsoever. But please do go to it if you can. And had I given that talk before Christmas, I would have ended it with the treaty itself. But events have intervened, and what I'm doing here today is starting with the treaty itself. And starting specifically with that. And I'm going to show you a few images and documents that are taken from both from the treaty and from the handover book that Ian would have mentioned. And I'm going to start with this one here because if one is talking about the handover of power in Ireland, you kind of need to sketch out the backdrop. You have to sketch out to some degree what was power being handed over to. And that means to some degree bringing the treaty into it. Now what you're seeing there, oh, sorry, my computer seems to have gone completely haywire here. What you're seeing here is, hold on a sec now. Now, that there is a stylized depiction of the treaty negotiations in London. There's no image of the negotiations in progress, but they took place in London between the 11th of October and the 6th of December 1921. So what you have there is a stylized depiction from the Illustrated London News of the negotiations in progress. And what you have there, I suppose, is the signature page of the culmination. The two sets of negotiators, led respectively by Arthur Griffith on the one hand and David Lloyd George on the other, who signed off on what were formerly known on the 6th of December as Articles of Agreement. They wouldn't become a treaty until they were ratified by assemblies in London and in Dublin, and we'll come to that in a moment. And it's worth just reminding yourself and sketching out what the treaty actually is, what it says. It's a fairly modest document. If you go to the exhibition, you'll see it on display. It's a fairly basic typescript, and it consists of 18 articles. Now, the first 4 articles basically define the independent Irish state that was coming into being. The Irish Free State, which would be a dominion within the Commonwealth and the British Empire. When people talk about the British Empire, it can be easy to forget that there were different kind of grades of imperial rule within the British Empire. And at the top of the heap, you might say, were what were called the dominions, or informally described as the white dominions, the settler colonies of the empire. Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland at that time, Canada, which was of particular interest and relevance to the treaty, and these were now to be joined in 1922 by the Irish Free State, which was to come into being on the 6th of December 1922, exactly a year after the signing of the document here in London. Now, the first 4 articles spell out what the Free State was going to be. It was going to be a dominion. It was going to have the same status as Canada, which was meant to reassure the Irish side that there would be no backsliding on the part of the British in terms of the autonomy they were granting in the treaty. Articles 5 to 10, and Article 10 we'll be coming back to in a little while. Articles 5 to 10 talk about, I suppose, more technical arrangements, British demands and requirements for naval defence, which were hugely important to the British and which they were insistent upon getting stitched into the treaty. Compensation for civil servants, the right of the future Irish Free State to establish a military, the fact that the ports of both Britain and Ireland would remain open to one another. Now, it's often forgotten that it's often thought that the treaty partitioned Ireland. It didn't. Ireland was partitioned in 1920, and the treaty, in fact, sets out or concedes the principle of an all-Ireland state. But Articles 11 to 15 set out and addressed issues of the existence of Northern Ireland, the question of partition, whether or not this would change or what status it would have. It's often suggested that partition had little or nothing to do with the treaty split that it would emerge over the treaty. There's a very strong case for that. But the question of partition was of vital importance to the negotiators who went to London and was one of the core issues that they sought to address as they negotiated. And the treaty set out 2 options. A, Northern Ireland, as established in 1920, could join the Irish Free State when it came into being and could continue to exist as a kind of federal assembly governing the 6 northeastern counties, or it could remain outside the Free State, in which case a boundary commission would adjudicate upon the boundary at some stage in the future. It was a way of squaring the circle and, I suppose, conceding to the Irish negotiators what they described as essential unity. Now, following that, Article 16 specifies that that both states on the island shouldn't pass laws that discriminate against religions of one type or another. And then, for our point of view, Articles 17 and 18 deal with the transition arrangements. How you get from that to the kind of events that would have been marked earlier on today in Athlone and have been marked throughout the early months of 1922. And I suppose when you talk about handovers of power, to a certain extent, what I want to talk about are maybe leftovers as much as handovers. It's often suggested that, and rightly so, that an independent state was created in Ireland from 1922 onwards. But it did inherit quite a few things from the outgoing British administration. There were foundations the British had left behind them. There were leftovers the British left behind them. And those kind of things are probably going to play a part in what I'm going to be talking here tonight. Now, one thing about the treaty, if I was to choose one thing that you could say was the cause of the Irish Civil War, it would be Article 4 of the treaty. And especially the bit at the end, the oath that specifies that whoever swore this will be faithful to His Majesty King George V, his heir and successor by law, and Ireland would remain part of a group of nations forming the British Commonwealth of Nations. Funnily enough, that's the first time the term Commonwealth of Nations was used in a legal sense in the treaty in 1921. And I suppose we have to view the way in which the British withdrew from Ireland. I mean, historians rightly look at the early British involvement in Ireland in the medieval and early modern periods as examples of English and British imperialism. And as parts of the history of the wider British Empire, it makes sense to look at how the British withdrew from Ireland, or from Southern Ireland, I should say, and I'll explain why I'm using that phrase in a moment. It makes sense to view that process in, I suppose, the wider context of how the British Empire began to break up in the 20th century as well. Now, as for, you're going to hear me say Southern Ireland a few times. It's often used as a pejorative term and viewed as a pejorative term when used today. But you can make a case for using Southern Ireland as a valid term from about May 1921 until December 1922, when the Irish Free State came into existence, because the clauses of the treaty that I suppose, permitted the transition to an independent state explicitly said they were dealing with the territory of what was called Southern Ireland in the Government of Ireland Act. So I think you can use that term validly for that period. The 26 counties that would have been governed by a parliament in Dublin had the Government of Ireland Act come into full effect, and which were governed by another parliament in Dublin after the foundation of the Free State. Now, one thing about the treaty, though, is that the treaty is very concerned with external relations, Ireland's relationship to the British Empire, whether or not Ireland could have military forces, its relationship to the United Kingdom in the form of Northern Ireland. It doesn't go into great detail, though, about what the Irish Free State was going to look like. And another reason, how it would be governed. There's very little in the treaty about that, and that's another reason to put up that Article 4 there. It's one of the few articles of the treaty that hints at what the Free State's government might look like. You can take from it that it would be it would have a parliament of some kind, that it would have members of that parliament. Presumably they would be elected. It would have a constitution of some kind, but it doesn't go into great detail. Article 10 is another article that specifies compensation for civil servants should they lose their jobs in the transfer of power. So there were going to be civil servants as well, and there was going to be a military of some kind. But the rest of it was kind of fairly vague, and I suppose that ties into some what I want to go into here today. Now, that's an image from the National Library of crowds gathered outside Earlsfort Terrace in Dublin at some point during the treaty debate between the 14th of December 1921 and the 7th of January 1922. When we were developing the National Archives exhibition, we basically stopped at the treaty debate, because there's plenty of division over the treaty. Plenty of people argue about the treaty, and we figured that would happen anyway. What we wanted to do was chart the path to the treaty. And in a way, that's one of the last images in the exhibition, and it's actually the final image in the exhibition catalogue, which is coming out soon. And we thought it was a great image because it shows that level of expectation, people waiting to hear what was going to happen, what was going to emerge from the council chamber of UCD in Earlsfort Terrace as a treaty was passed and debated and argued over. And on 7th of December, it's suggested that the treaty was ratified by the Dáil. Now, the catch was, what the Dáil record says that the treaty was approved. It wasn't technically ratified. Because this brings us to an issue here, which is something that is sometimes, I feel, overlooked when we talk about this period. Because the focus on the split, which is of existential importance to modern Irish history, we tend sometimes to forget that the British themselves were preparing to leave and had their own kind of process and dynamics and means of doing so. And while the treaty debate was ongoing in Dublin, the British were making their preparations to withdraw from the 26 counties of Southern Ireland, because they were going. They accepted that. They were going under certain terms. They were going under terms that suited them, because don't forget, the treaty was not signed, Lloyd George didn't say immediate and terrible war, but the treaty was signed with a resumption of war and a resumption of conflict, and that lurks in the background as well. The British were preparing to withdraw, and the British never recognised Dáil Éireann as having any validity or legal standing. If they had, there would have been no need for the treaty. There would have been no need for the War of Independence. The British accepted the Dáil existed. They accepted that it had a political relevance, that it was representative of Republican opinion. But as far as they were concerned, in legal terms, it didn't count for anything. And what the treaty actually says is that the treaty had to be ratified by the British Parliament on the one hand, but by a very different assembly in Dublin, not the Dáil. Politically, in terms of the treaty split, the Dáil is what mattered. Legally, constitutionally, as far as the British were concerned, in terms of leaving Ireland, another assembly had to meet. Sometimes this is incorrectly described as the Parliament of Southern Ireland. It wasn't. The British insisted that the treaty would have to be ratified by a meeting of the members of those elected to the Parliament of Southern Ireland, who would assemble for the purpose. Now, I'm getting into the area of kind of dancing on the heads of pins here with legalities. But the Parliament of Southern Ireland was the counterpart of the Parliament of Northern Ireland and was elected in the summer of 1921. Now, the catch from the British point of view was that virtually all of those elected to the Parliament of Southern Ireland were Sinn Féin MPs, and they went off and became the TDs of the second Dáil. But a small number would have assembled in Dublin as the Parliament of Southern Ireland in the summer of 1921. They met for about 40 minutes, realised nobody else was going to turn up, and swiftly adjourned. In British law, however, that was the ruling assembly in Ireland, or at least in the 26 counties. Now, the British also recognised that they could hardly turn around to pro-treaty Republicans and say you have to become the Parliament of Southern Ireland now as well, because politically that would be fairly obnoxious to them. The British wanted this process to succeed. So the treaty says that those elected to the Parliament of Southern Ireland, in other words, elected in an election the British would recognise, they would have to meet, they would have to rubber stamp the treaty, and they would have to fulfil the obligation of the final article of the treaty, or the second last article of the treaty, which is appoint a provisional government to oversee the transition of power from British rule to Irish rule that was expected to take place throughout 1922. And that is a picture of the parliamentary meeting, or the meeting of parliamentary representatives that took place a week after the Dáil vote on the 14th of Saturday the 14th of January 1922 in the Mansion House. It basically consisted of the pro-treaty TDs of the second Dáil and those members of the Parliament of Southern Ireland who had been elected for Trinity College Dublin. And in the front row, you see various familiar faces, many of whom would go on to fulfil the second part of that meeting's business. Because the meeting did two things. Basically said, right, we approve of the treaty, and then they were going to appoint a provisional government to bring it into being. Now, this then brings us, I suppose, to the 16th of January, another anniversary, which is described as the handover of Dublin Castle. And that's something to come back to in a little while. But if you'd woken up on the 16th of January, 2 days after these guys had met and that photo was taken, if you'd woken up and bought the Freeman's Journal on Monday, the 16th of January, that's what you would have been confronted with when you opened up its pages. Dublin Castle falls after 7th century siege. Auxiliaries caused a sensation at Holyhead because they would not go ashore. One thing about the treaty is that its clause about compensation for civil servants didn't apply to the auxiliaries in Black and Tans. So they were being pensioned off, but apparently a load of them who had been demobilised refused to get off the ferry at Holyhead until they got a better redundancy package off the British government. And one of Irish history's kind of curious footnotes, many of those in the auxiliary division and the Black and Tans later became paramilitary policemen in British Mandate Palestine in the 1920s. But that's another story and another digression. If you'd opened the paper the morning of the 16th of January, that's what you would have seen. Now, earlier this year, an event was marked in Dublin Castle, the handover of Dublin Castle. And I suppose, you know, to give you a kind of flavour of how this was viewed and how this was covered, even aside from that kind of coverage there, here's a quote from the Irish Independent that said, the new Irish Provisional Government would soon, quote, be entering Dublin Castle as representatives of the Irish nation to deal with that hotbed of bureaucracy, tyranny, reaction and misrule in accordance with the wishes of the Irish people, now its acknowledged masters, and in their name to end forever the iniquities of Castle's so-called government. 2 days before the treaty was signed, Arthur Griffith had written to Eamon de Valera to state that the British had been adamant that they wanted a deal, that if they signed the version of the treaty that was on offer, and I'm paraphrasing here, they would hand over Dublin Castle and withdraw their troops from the country. And Dublin Castle is a kind of term and a place name that pops up quite a bit in Irish history, especially if one is, especially in the part of Nationalists and Republicans. And to give a sense of why it might pop up, I'll show you another picture, if I can find it. That, which is in the wrong order here, but you know what, I'll just keep talking and hopefully that will paper over the cracks. And that's obviously not from 1922. That's an image from 1580, John Derrick's The Image of Ireland, regarded as kind of, I suppose, one of the great examples of Elizabethan woodcuts, written to, I suppose, sing the praises of the Tudor Viceroy Henry Sidney, who's on the horse there. You can see at the top, these trunkless heads do plainly show each rebel's fatal end, and what a heinous crime it is the Queen for to offend, and you can see the heads over the gate there. And that's one of the earliest depictions of Dublin Castle, but it also sends out a message. It sends out a message of British power, British force, a British desire to crush rebellion in Ireland as they saw it. And in a way that encapsulates how Dublin Castle would have been seen by many nationalists and Republicans at the start of the 20th century. I spent years doing walking tours in Dublin. Whenever you brought people near Dublin Castle, I used to kind of tell the tourists that, you know, it's a bit like, if you were a Republican, this place is a bit like Mordor and the Lord of the Rings, you know, the place of the seat of evil and tyranny. And it's no exaggeration to think that Dublin Castle was viewed in that way. And it came with a symbolic weight. It wasn't like taking over, you could take over the Mansion House, you could take the Mansion House, take over Dublin City Hall, you could take over, I don't know, wherever. But taking over Dublin Castle had a particular resonance. I mean, Eamon Broy, who had a rather colourful career, you know, both in the Dublin Metropolitan Police and in the independence movement, I suppose, they said that Dublin Castle was believed by the people to be the centre and focus of all that was evil and secret and sinister. And Dublin Castle was traditionally where the British administration in Ireland was governed, the civil service and bureaucracy that governed the country. I mean, many of you will be familiar with Dublin Castle, and it's a kind of modest collection of Georgian and some medieval buildings. In the War of Independence, it would have been, you know, fortified, heavily guarded. It became a home for the families of civil servants and civil servants themselves as it became too dangerous for them to reside in private residences around Dublin City. It was occupied or housed three divisions of the auxiliaries. And it's a place in which Republicans would have been detained, interrogated, tortured, and indeed murdered. Owen McNeill, when he was brought in there in late 1920, recalled in his memoir, which was only published a few years ago, that he was brought into a room and, a British soldier showed him a spot on the wall and said, "That's the brains of one of your lot," implying that one of, possibly a reference to Conor Clune or Peadar Clancy or Dick McKee, who'd been killed in the castle on the night of Bloody Sunday. But it came with a particular resonance, and even after its alleged handover, and I'll explain why I say alleged handover in a little while, as Dublin Castle was name-checked it's in the same way we talk about the Irish government, we say Leinster House now. Back then you'd say Dublin Castle, but it meant British government in Ireland, or British misgovernment and misrule in Ireland. It could be compared to the Bastille. It could be depicted as an enemy citadel, and a castle or a fortress, imbued with sinister meaning. And one that the press, on the morning of the 16th and 17th of January 1922, made it very clear had fallen. So there was a resonance, a symbolic power that came with it. And now that's, you might say, how it looked, how it was depicted. But then it comes to the point of what actually happened there on the 16th of January 1922, because you can make the case there were two Dublin castles, the real one and the one that stood in as a synonym for the Irish government, or the Irish administration, to be more precise. Now, on the 14th of January, there had been a meeting in the Mansion House, and there were suggestions. The treaty specified that the provisional government that had to come into being had to accept the terms of the treaty in writing, and that meant they had to basically meet a representative of the British government, presumably the Viceroy, Lord Fitzalan, and fulfil the obligations that they had signed up to. It was suggested on the apparently within hours of that meeting in the Mansion House on the morning of the 14th of January, there were suggestions that members of the new provisional government could go to Dublin Castle, meet the Viceroy, and get themselves appointed. That didn't happen, apparently because Michael Collins was too busy and the Viceroy refused to meet anyone lesser than the chairman of that provisional government. And even on the Sunday, it was being reported that there was uncertainty about what was going to happen. That if anything happened in Dublin Castle on Monday, it would happen quickly, it would be informal, but the arrangements weren't finalised until the morning of the 16th of January 1922. And this is a document from the National Archives that is actually the first set of minutes of the provisional government, which met for the first time in the Mansion House on the 16th of January 1922. And what it says at the bottom is, arrangements are made to visit Dublin Castle at 1:40 p.m. in the afternoon for the purpose of taking over the main departments of state. So, all sounds fairly formal. And it's worth sketching out what would have happened that day, because it was widely flagged in the press that something was going to happen. Now, there's an image of what this actually looked like, and it comes from Neil Jordan's Michael Collins. It's a fiction. What happened in Dublin Castle on the 16th of January 1922 was a brief procedural meeting, regardless of how it was depicted by the press, regardless of how it was expected or anticipated by onlookers. And there were many onlookers. The streets around Dublin Castle were filled with expectant onlookers from an early hour, and all of whom were waiting for things to happen. And then at about, say, 1:30 p.m., one taxi depicted here, 3 taxis and a horse-drawn Jarvie drove through the gates of the castle with the Irish Provisional Government. So the image you have in Michael Collins of, lads in uniforms, the uniforms didn't exist. There were no bands, there weren't even flags flown on the day, apparently. And this here is supposed to the arrival of Fitzalan, the Viceroy. And I should say, if you're going to mention one thing of Michael Collins, it's worth mentioning kind of one of the great yarns or stories about the handover of Dublin Castle, which is the alleged line about Michael Collins, the alleged quip from Michael Collins about being upbraided by a British official and for being 7 minutes late, and supposedly saying that we've been waiting 700 years. When myself and my colleague Kate O'Malley were writing our book about the handover of Dublin Castle, we kind of thought, well, you have to look into that. That's something that has to be there, so we better find it and track it down. We couldn't. The only place we could find it in was Tim Coogan's biography of Michael Collins. So it makes you wonder. What we did find was, however, the account of Sean Clancy, who was in the IRA, who went on to a long and distinguished career in the Defence Forces, and who on numerous occasions recalled a similar exchange that took place in Dublin Castle, but with a very, very different wording to the accepted version of it. In Clancy's wording, and he expressed this in an interview to RTE, what he heard was Collins' reply, "Blast you, sure, your people are here 7 centuries, so what bloody difference does 7 minutes make now?" a very different kind of wording, and that stayed consistent in various iterations of that story that he would have recounted in the course of his career. Now, we began to check it out because he's the only person who records this. We couldn't corroborate it. But we began to look around at some of his accounts, and certainly some details do seem to tally. I mean, he mentions that the person who upbraided Collins for being a few minutes late, and bear in mind, like, you know, they were due to turn up at 1:40, so they were kind of on time. So maybe there was 7 minutes in the difference, who knows? He does mention that the official who greeted Collins was a tall, handsome man in a morning coat, a good-looking fella. I remember looking at this photo, and that guy beside the Viceroy, Fitzallen's wearing the hat. This fella beside him, tall, morning coat. Is he good-looking? Not my type, perhaps, but perhaps you might have a different opinion. And it's hard to tell. We can't corroborate it, but you have to take note of it. And the thing is, though, Clancy specifically said he did hear this exchange, but we'll never know for certain the full details of this. In a way, it's a distraction, because if this exchange did take place, and we have to assume that it did, or at least it's plausible that it did, then it was a prelude to what was a very, very short procedural meeting that lasted for less than an hour, that took place in an archway just above the upper and lower castle yards of Dublin Castle, the Privy Council chamber, which was sit above the archway that leads into the lower and upper yards, which is actually now a reconstruction. The structure had to be rebuilt in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, due to structural problems. Now, this is a spread from the Illustrated London News that shows you some of what was going on. It's a set of snapshots of the day. Here you have a British sentry on display, waiting presumably for the provisional government to arrive. If you look at the top, you can see the ragged fringe of a canvas screen. There were canvas screens erected all around Dublin Castle during the War of Independence to obscure the views into the castle, and to secure it from attack. At the top, the guards on duty in the castle, Collins entering, Fitzallen leaving. Here you have the side of what is now of Dublin City Hall, with barricades and sandbag positions being taken down. Auxiliaries at the top. Apparently there were people thronging around the yards of the castle at this stage. There were lots of very happy auxiliaries because they had been demobilised that morning and they were still hanging around and milling around. And then here you have crowds of onlookers, many of whom would have been the clerical staff in the castle, outside the Chief Secretary's office at the corner of the yard, waiting for the provisional government to come out. You can see kind of people looking out the windows up there. And what I want to show you, and I would do this in a very, very smooth manner, was enough for the fact that my computer went on the blink just as I stood up and therefore became a victim of Murphy's Law. I want to basically show you something from what I actually can't now because something has gone wrong here. And what I'd love to show it to you, and I might get a chance to show it to you later at the end, I can't show it to you now. But there are newsreel footage. There is newsreel footage of what happened that day. There's a few short newsreels. Leave it with me, okay? But we'll stick to the still photographs for the moment. This is Collins and the car carrying Collins leaving the upper castle yard after the meeting. The meeting lasted about 55 minutes. It took place, and the thing about it is that it was very visible. Like, if you're familiar with that location, there were big plate glass windows on either side of the Privy Council chamber. And a curious legal detail is that technically, to some degree, the provisional government were legally regarded by the British as effectively a Privy Council, an advisory board to the Viceroy, to the Governor, the Lord Lieutenant. And this came from a slight loophole in the treaty, which is that when the British began to kind of look into the detail of how you implement the treaty, they realised they actually didn't have any legal basis for appointing a provisional government. They couldn't legally set one up. But they were conscious that they had to move quickly. So the provisional government in British law, for the first few months of its existence, was essentially an advisory body to the Viceroy on whose authority they would act. And this was a legal fiction devised by the British to give them, I suppose, a legal basis in which to operate. And understandably, that's not something that was publicised at the time. Now, one senior civil servant present for the meeting, and the meeting consisted of Collins and his colleagues going in, up the stairs, meeting the Viceroy, signifying their acceptance of the terms of the treaty. Not sure whether paperwork actually changed hands, because in 1922, the signed copy of the treaty, if there was one, had gone missing and was still missing in 1972 when someone went looking for it. But it was stated that they had verbally accepted the terms of the treaty. And then they were introduced to the senior civil servants, the heads of the departments that they were now going to be in charge of, who were now shifting from the British regime to a new provisional government. And one of them, William Robinson, said, and I quote from his memoirs here, "On the day fixed for the surrender of the government to Sinn Féin, I received a telephone message to attend at the council to be introduced to the victors." What struck me most was the extreme youth of most of the new ministers. They seemed scarcely out of their teens, and all looked pale and anxious. No doubt they had been through a period of terrible anxiety, and they certainly looked gloomy and overpowered with the consciousness of responsibility for the future government of the country. Michael Collins, their spokesman, however, was cordiality itself, and there was none of the top-dog attitude about him at all events. I was rather amused to hear people asking each other whether the civil servants would be expected to shake hands with men whose hands were stained with outrage and crime, but if the civil servants had any doubt on the subject themselves, they were speedily dispelled by Michael Collins, who grasped their hands in his iron grip and shook them warmly. And after all this was done, they left. Went back to the Mansion House and resumed the meeting they'd been having earlier on that day. And these are the minutes of the meeting of the Provisional Government that took place at 4 p.m. According to Michael Collins' colleague, Bat O'Connor, who was in the yard at the time, O'Connor apparently accompanied them back to the Mansion House, and apparently when they went in, Collins looked for Arthur Griffith and shouted, "Griffith, the castle has fallen." And it's funny because when they met at 11 o'clock in the morning, they met saying that they were going to take over the various departments of states, i.e. the civil service. Later on that day, and this is the draft statement that was issued to newspapers that night, they say they accepted the surrender of Dublin Castle. So something had changed in a matter of a few hours. Earlier on, they were coming over to take over civil service departments. Later on that day, they had accepted the surrender of Dublin Castle. And you could say, and this is something that was, I suppose, amplified in coverage of the event that took place the next day. Here you have, later on, that's a copy of the statement that they issued that night, basically stating that they were now in charge of the civil service. You might look closely at the top because the headquarters of the Provisional Government are listed there, not as Dublin Castle, but as Dublin City Hall, which is a different place entirely. That probably came a little bit later, given that, there was headed newspaper. It didn't have stationary uniforms on the 16th of January, so this is presumably a later copy. And then, if that wasn't enough excitement for you for the whole day, you could have gone to that show in the Theatre Royal later that night. Susie Marnie, Billy Sunday, the three Ernests, Lillian Barnes, the Nathano brothers. I'm sure they had a great night, okay? And that was the handover of Dublin Castle, we are told. The way in which it was reported, though, is a bit different to how you might report a brief procedural meeting. Dublin Castle in the hands of the Irish people. And then on top of that, mysterious tragedies, armed desperados at work in Dublin. That's the Evening Herald from later that day. That's the Irish Independent the next day. Seed of evil rule passes into the nation's control. Symbol of triumph and freedom. Last of the Viceroy surrenders Dublin Castle. Now, the catch was, when a few weeks later, representatives of the Provisional Government went into Dublin Castle to see if they could get office space, they realised they couldn't because it was still filled with British troops. On Patrick's Day, 2 months after the 16th of January, British troops were still celebrating St. Patrick's Day in the castle. And if you look at that there, that's dated, August 1922. Taken over of Dublin Castle. It was decided that the acting chairman should see the Commander-in-Chief and Mr. Cope with a view to arranging the final takeover of the castle by the Provisional Government. So Dublin Castle wasn't actually handed over to anyone on the 16th of January, at least not the physical complex. The Provisional Government didn't take control of it until a few months later. It's a bit, Dublin Castle would be name-checked quite a lot over the course of the next few months. But in terms of how it was viewed at the time, if you go back to the newspaper coverage, the British were quite critical of that. Neville Macready, the British commander in Ireland, said the statement that was issued by Michael Collins and his colleagues was bombastic. Some civil servants felt that they had prompted the newspapers to this kind of coverage, that they had basically spun it to a certain extent. And it makes sense that they would try and make capital out of it, like describing what was a procedural meeting in Dublin Castle as something far different to what it was, that it was the surrender of an enemy citadel, the capture of an enemy citadel, that they would try and get some kind of good publicity, you might say, in the midst of the treaty split, because don't forget Republican hostility to these events, as depicted in this image here. This cartoon, which is probably a bit more closer, you might say, to some of the depictions in Neil Jordan's film, but with Collins bowing obsequiously before the British governor. And then, was it for this they died, the executed men of 1916, and a cartoon drawn by one of their widows, Grace Gifford, the widow of Joseph Mary Plunkett, who's depicted there, a Republican perspective on events that are depicted euphorically by pro-treaty nationalists and the press immediately after they happened. And to a certain extent, you might think that you wonder, did the British miss a trick here? I mean, when we think of handovers of power, we tend to think of them through, and I presume this influenced the depiction in the Michael Collins movie, we think of them in terms of the ceremonial events, especially in the British Empire, that would come in the aftermath of the Second World War as the empire collapsed. Ceremonial events that were meant to give the impression that the British were granting power willingly, that would enable them to kind of keep and maintain a link or influence in a paternalistic way to their former colonies. In 1922, the British Empire was still standing. It had been one of the victor powers in the First World War. The previous experience of losing a colony had last been in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris that ended the American War of Independence. So this was uncharted territory. But there's a clue to be said that there's a clue as to what they were thinking, which is that the Irish may have viewed taking over Dublin Castle as a big deal. From the British point of view, there was a bigger deal to be had in terms of leaving Ireland and handing over. Because over the next few months, there would be various kind of initiatives in terms of taking over power, taking over the civil service that the British had left behind, which would eventually, as I was morph and amalgamate into the civil service of the Free State, developing the constitution of the Free State, as hinted at in the treaty, and also developing an army. And in a way, that kind of brings you to perhaps what the British were thinking at the time, or what they felt would send a message that they were leaving, and that power was being transferred over into Irish hands. The day after the handover of Dublin Castle, the provisional government met again, and within a few days, representatives were in London, and they began to thrash out the nitty-gritty details of handing over power and authority, of handing over, like the British had ruled Ireland for centuries. Unpicking that was not going to be done overnight. And some of the kind of things that are listed in this meeting, which would have been attended by figures like Churchill, Collins, various others, I mean, some of the things that are mentioned there, like the Hugh Lane paintings, a live issue. Who was going to get them? Arms smuggling from Hamburg, which the British obviously didn't approve of. British troops restive at indignities, as is quoted there. The fact that discipline might be breaking down within British troops, and that could Collins and his colleagues put a lid on low-level attacks that were taking place directed at British forces still in Ireland. Compensation claims for damage in the War of Independence. Irish Lights. Who was going to administer Irish Lights? An all-Ireland body. The demobilisation of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. And above all, for our purposes, list of arms and equipment for the provisional government that Collins was providing and which Winston Churchill warmly viewed and warmly endorsed and viewed as essential. Because one of Churchill's colleagues, Hammer Greenwood, Churchill was the key figure in overseeing the British transition, the British side of the handover power, as he was the colonial secretary. The last Chief Secretary of Ireland, though, Hammer Greenwood, had written to his cabinet colleagues at the end of January to say, quote, "There should be no unavoidable delay in carrying through the evacuation of the Crown forces from Ireland, and thus demonstrating in a most effectual manner to the Irish people that the treaty is a reality and marks the renunciation forever of the British government's claim to interfere in the internal government of their country." So there's a difference in how the two sides might see what was more meaningful, because the British did realise that they had to leave, and did seem to take the view that they would leave in a way that would be public and that would send a message that they were leaving the 26 counties. It's just that Dublin Castle doesn't seem to have factored into how they viewed that. What did come into it was the withdrawal of their military, the withdrawal of their garrison. And the sentiments that were in Greenwood's note to the cabinet, I mean, they were reflected in some of the addresses that were given to Sean McGowan in Athlone this day 100 years ago, that described what became Custume Barracks as a citadel of oppression, that pointed out that the British were leaving, that cottoned onto the symbolism that both sides would have been aware of. I mean, in terms of how this thing, I mean, there were elements of the handover of power that showed some level of continuity, I mean, this is the bulletin these are two versions of the Bulletin of the Irish Public Service, first published in the late 1660s and still being published today. But you can see how at the end of January 1922, there was a subtle shift in the name, but the typefaces and the layout was pretty much the same. Over the course of the next few months, and this is a map that emerges from the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, of the withdrawal of the British garrison from Ireland. As soon as the provisional government was in place, the British began to withdraw their forces, and they began to leave what became Southern Ireland rapidly. And by the end of May 1922, a garrison that had been in place for centuries, that at the peak of the War of Independence had numbered well over 50,000, was gone pretty much completely. And I mean, this one under the black dots indicate RIC barracks. The RIC would have been disbanded to be replaced by what became the Garda Síochána. The middle one depicts the process of the withdrawal. And you can see how in January, garrisons would have left Dublin, parts of County Cork, some parts of Munster, especially Tipperary. And then in February, the British Army withdrawing comprehensively from Connacht, from across the Midlands and down into the southeast. The blue indicates March and April, final garrisons. And you can see a process where they were moving towards the coast. And this didn't take place necessarily in a peaceful environment. There were attacks on British soldiers as they were leaving. The British were conscious that they had to secure material that could be given over to the provisional government. Some troops would have been stationed in Northern Ireland. I mean, a couple of motor launches were apparently taken from the Shannon Estuary across inland waterways and then brought up to Carlingford Lough. And by the end of May, basically the British garrison in Southern Ireland was effectively gone, apart from the 3 bases stipulated in the treaty. The British were quite adamant on naval defence in the treaty. After World War I, they were obsessed with the prospect of submarine warfare, that in a future war they might be blockaded and they might be denied access to the Atlantic and therefore to trade routes into their empire. And actually the treaty specifies 4 treaty ports, not just the 3 illustrated there. It's just that the 4th treaty port was Belfast Lough. Just in case Northern Ireland opted to come into the Free State, someone remembered in the small print to put in something about keeping a base in the northeast of the island as well as the northwest. The big red dot points out, though, the Dublin Garrisons, which were kept in place until the Free State came into existence in December 1922. Because when we think of the military conflict around the treaty, that emerged from the treaty, we naturally think of the split in the Republican movement, the split in the independence movement. But it's worth bearing in mind that the treaty had been, I suppose, signed under duress, and the British maintained a garrison in Dublin until December 1922, just to make sure that the Free State came into existence. In early 1922, Neville Macready, the British General Officer commanding, took the view that as far as he was concerned, the British withdrawal should happen quickly, without interruption, that they should leave. As far as he was concerned, by staying in the country, they were becoming an irritant, they were becoming a target. They were less effective in combating Republicans of the IRA because they were so preoccupied with, packing up and leaving that they'd lost much of their capacity and effectiveness. And he was also concerned about being brought into any civil conflict that might emerge. But he also said explicitly that, we should leave quickly because if we had to come back, they could do that quickly as well. If they had to reoccupy the 26 counties, they could do that from Northern Ireland. It could be done via coastal ports. The garrison in Dublin was expressly tasked with seizing Dublin in the event of either a coup d'etat or a republic repudiation of the treaty. So that lurked in the background as well. But the handover of power that would have taken place across Ireland, it took many forms. And there isn't time or space here to go into the issue of, what was created in the course of 1922. The Constitution, new security forces, new elements of public administration. What I'm dealing with here is the stuff that the British left behind, and the simple text of the treaty doesn't even scratch the surface of that vastly complex subject of disentangling all these things that had existed for centuries and handing them over to a new administration in a part of the United Kingdom that had left the rest of it. That's an image from the National Library of Athlone about 100 years ago, as members of what was becoming the new National Army marched into what was then Custume Barracks. And this was a scene that was replicated across the island in the early months of 1922. The Defence Forces have been marking it with events in their installations over the past few weeks, and I presume will continue to do so over the next few weeks and months. But the departure of the British garrison, if even bearing in mind the dissension over the treaty, the handing over of power, the fact that the civil service, which was, I suppose, the real effective element of Dublin Castle, was handed over to an Irish government, the fact that Irish troops were replacing the garrison that had been in situ for centuries, and that garrison left very, very visibly. And very often those departures were big events, they were ceremonial events, marching bands and so forth. When the British left, they did so visibly. In the aftermath of World War I, lots of countries got their independence, especially in Eastern Europe. The Irish Free State is one of those countries, albeit in the west of the continent. What makes the Irish Free State distinctive from the other countries that got their independence in Western Europe? Well, a couple of things make it distinctive, but the big one is this. It got its independence from one of the victor powers in the First World War, not one of the defeated empires that are fragmented in the aftermath of the war. And a point was made by a colleague of mine, Edward Madigan, that if you look at how much Germany lost 13% of its territory after the Treaty of Versailles, the United Kingdom lost something like 22% of its territory in the aftermath of the War of Independence, as it fragmented and as the Irish Free State came into being. Now, it's a part of the story of the Irish Revolution that sometimes doesn't get, I don't think gets the attention it sometimes deserves. Not the fact that there was a treaty, and there was a split over treaty, and a state was created, but that the other power in the land left, withdrew, and did so visibly. And there is a story there that I think is worth bearing in mind as we march through these centenaries. As for Dublin Castle, it would never house the seat of a government again. But in the same way we say Leinster House now, Dublin Castle would have been set a century ago. And I'm going to kind of leave it there. I'm going to leave it there with a plug for that exhibition, because if you haven't got a chance to go and see it, please do go to see it. It's on display in Dublin Castle until the 27th of March of this year. Admission is free. There'll then be a national tour. I don't think it's come to Westmeath, but you never know, that may change, of a version of the exhibition. There's an online version of the exhibition as well. It charts how I suppose that treaty came into being, because without that treaty, you couldn't have what flowed on from it. If you can't get to it, there will be an exhibition catalogue, and then there's this thing here. Now, you might think I'm plugging this to make myself a rich man. Neither of these things will make you rich men. But what the handover will do is that any royalties, the small, meagre royalties that one gets from these things, are being donated to Focus Ireland. So we've decided the books are being published by our employer. The most appropriate thing is to donate any royalties to a charity. You're getting that's the first public exhibition of what will be the treaty catalogue. And I suppose when it comes to things like this, make up your own mind, explore them at your will. But given that I'm in Athlone and as a transplanted resident of Westmeath, it's most appropriate to leave that as the final image there. So thank you for your time. Thank you for turning out. I hope some of this is hung together, and I think I'd speak for Ian as well in saying we'd be happy to take any questions you may have. And if I can get that bit of footage up and running, I will, but this yoke is on the blink, so bear with me.